1, 2, 1, 2.
First Vice President and Minister of Tourism, members of the Executive of the Democratic Labour Party, distinguished panelists and moderator, specially invited guests, ladies and gentlemen, a very special good evening to you. As principal of the Tudor Institute of Politics, it gives me great pleasure in welcoming you to this evening's panel discussion. The theme being the evolving industrial relations climate in Barbados, the way forward. I wish to offer an apology for the Prime Minister. He'll be running a bit late, but he's sure to join us this evening. The next activity for the Academy, the Institute, can be viewed as refreshing and timely. Refreshing in the sense that it has been for some time now that the Institute has executed such activities. And I would wish to offer at this stage kudos to Mr. Astor B. Watts, who would have kept the illuminating light shining along the way through his lectures on Fridays instituted by the Unity Bar. I must say that the personal intervention of the party chairman, the Right Honorable Prime Minister of Barbados, with a view to resuscitating the Academy, saw the appointment of a new committee with the principal as chair, and the examination of issues and themes to be rolled out as educational activities. I can say that on the 30th of September, we'll be having a similar activity, maybe a lecture or a discussion on housing. In October, we don't have the specific date, but we'll be looking at the role of the state in economic activity. And in November, there'll be some issue related to independence to be discussed, just to mention three that will be rather imminent. The next activity, the planning of which has benefited from the input of Minister Seeley, is but the first of the activities to be rolled out. Yes, the next activity is most timely. The next activity is most timely, given the national preoccupation over the past months with matters of industrial relations importance. In the aftermath of this national preoccupation, many areas of uncertainty and confusion still remain. Among other things, citizens have developed various views on the importance of trade unions and the effectiveness of labor legislation, and some have even been caustic towards fellow workers, union members. The next activity promises to lay bare the issues and offer meaningful solutions. You will leave this place the more enlightened. I wish to welcome you again most warmly and wish that you do have a most engaging evening. I thank you.
Good night, comrades and friends. To
Tonight, as you have heard, we are going to be examining through the discussions at the level of this panel and through your own interventions the topic which is presenting the evolving IR climate in Barbados, the way forward. On our panel this evening, we have Ambassador Morris, who is Ambassador Bobby Morris, who is our ambassador to CARICOM. Next to him, we have Mr. Hal Gollop Q.C., who is a lawyer, attorney at law in his own right, as well as the chairman of the Employment Rights Tribunal. And next to him, we have Dr. Akhentoolove Corbin, who is a lecturer at the University of the West Indies and academic in his own right, as well as a former HR practitioner. How we are going to proceed this evening, we are going to allow each member of the panel a 5-minute presentation to give you their views on the topic that is here for our discussion, and thereafter we will then engage in some further discussion from some direct questions, and thereafter we will open the floor for general discussion. So I will start by asking Mr. Ambassador Morris to share his views on the evolving IR climate in Barbados and the way forward.
Thank you very much, moderator. Minister Seeley, Principal Seeley, who is also in control of the Institute Academy, the President of CIDUSAP, moderator, fellow panelists, distinguished ladies and gentlemen. My initial thanks goes to the Tudor Institute for organizing this panel discussion to fill a need and to fill a gap for serious discourse on issues which are national, regional, and global in their reach. While our discourse concentrates on Barbados, we are cognizant of industrial relations tensions in Jamaica within the context of an IMF program in St. Vincent and the Grenadines. In fact, I've been asked by the labor movement to come to speak to them as soon as possible. They wanted me on the 13th, but I was traveling to Suriname on a government mission, so we couldn't go. In Antigua, where they're concerned over the line flow merger, and of course, widely, industrial relations is a very, very topical issue. Here in Barbados, contentious issues have included restructuring of parastatal organizations with related concerns like redundancies and forced retirements. We've been hearing, especially in the public sector, about safety and health at work issues. There are issues about compensation and work. Of course, we were faced recently with threats of a national strike, which is one of the most serious things that any country can contemplate. Because I've always said that a national strike is a declaration of war. It's a declaration of the beginning of civil war. And as a historian, I always tell people, if they knew what happened in 1926, these powerful trade unions of Britain started to think in terms of a national strike, causing Churchill to bring out the troops, and I mean the troops, the tanks and everything else. And Britain never really talked about a national strike again. And we talk about it right calmly here, as though it is business as usual. So I think it's very important that we sit down in panels and discussions like these and to raise the discussions to a level which is based more on academic, to some extent, intellectual, but a serious level. And this is not a popular discussion. I hope it is one that tries to get to the heat of the real issues that we're looking at. Now, some commentators have raised issues about constitutional rights, freedom of association, as though that they have been under challenge. So we need to look at that and what it means within the context of industrial relations. Questions have been arisen about where the social partnership is at this time, as though it's under some kind of a stress. When in fact, as soon after that, then meetings were held and then nothing else, no more criticism. So we tend then sometimes to get heated about issues. And as soon as an event comes off, we forget it. So nobody talked after the meeting about what the purpose of the meeting was and how good it was or anything like that. Very little. But in the lead of it is, when is the social partner going to meet? Is there still a social partnership? So we have to be very careful about how these discourses and these conversations are conducted and by whom. It's very, very important that the Sir James Tudor Institute takes a lead in helping to develop the type and standard of discourse that's important. The Employment Rights Tribunal has started to work, put out a magnificent judgment, as I call it, and then after that you hear nothing more about it. But in the lead-up, everyone wants to know what is wrong with the tribunal, what is happening. So we have to be careful in terms of the environment in which we're working, that we have this kind of discourse. And we have to look at that tribunal, very important, and its impact on the future industrial relations system. Put the above together, it will appear that the focus of discussions on NIR has been primarily about collective bargaining, grievance handling, and dispute resolution. And those are merely what I call the processes, the major processes of industrial relations. But I want to go further. I believe that we have to get into root and branch analysis of our industrial relations systems as one of the major subsystems cutting across the economic system, the political system, and the social systems. So we're not looking at just tiny aspects of industrial relations. I prefer the systems approach. I think people are familiar with the concept of the systems approach, led by people like Gollop from industrial relations, but based on work on sociologists like Tudor Parsons and so on. What some people call the structural functional approach, the input-output system, etc. But I think we have to look at the system as it is. And Gollop talks about the various components of that system. We have to look at the actors, we have to look at the context in which we are operating. We have to look at ideologies and how they impact things. And then we have to look at the rules of the game. Whether we're talking about collective bargaining rules or we're talking about labor legislation in various forms. I think we have to examine all of these to decide where we are, if there are gaps, and what are the gaps that we have to fill and how we go about filling those gaps. But I would say this, perhaps we must not be misguided by focusing too much on the actors in the system. And I think that has been popular in terms of these young people, where they're coming from, what their views are, what they'll be saying, etc. But I think that's a minor part of the total discourse. You will always have change in personnel. Actors will come and actors will go. And an actor in the first years, or actors in their first years of operation, are not going to be the same thing as they mature as they get older. And I'm not thinking maturity in any qualitative sense. That's a different perception. But nobody at 30 is going to be the same thing as the person at 60. So we have to be very careful in terms of how we get into discussion about the actors. Let's concentrate more on the system as a whole. Don't let us be sidetracked into getting into personalities. I don't think that's a very important way in terms of conducting our analysis. I think it's very important that we focus on things like the legal context. Look at our legal system in terms of industrial relations. Is it where it should be? It's almost the same thing as when we started 70 years ago. The model that we borrowed, the country that we borrowed from, has changed significantly in terms of its industrial relations system, and we're comfortable where we are on a model that was designed in a context that is so different from today's context. We have to be very, very careful. Our economic system has changed, our political system has changed. all of our systems, the larger systems have changed. But a major subsystem, the industrial relations system, has remained almost unchanged in terms of the structure, its legal structure. So clearly, I think there's a perception, if it isn't broke, don't fix it. But the question is it really not broken? That's the whole issue. Have we examined it in terms of its relevance to where we are today? So we talk a lot about this so-called voluntary system. I want to look at that. Do we really have a voluntary system? Or have we moved so far towards regulation that we're just looking at some small areas where it is still voluntarism? And as I heard going forward with Saturday's Barbados Workers Union conference, I'm hearing for a question of government coming in to look at the questions of security officers, etc. If that is a request for government to not only investigate, but to help set terms and conditions, and that's the question of moving towards regulation again. Because normally it was the forte of the trade union to organize groups of workers and determine what the terms and conditions are. So if they're now saying to the government, we want you to take on that, that is really an ambition that in some cases regulation, government coming in and setting the standards is becoming very important. And it might mean that, in fact, some of our young thinkers in the trade union movement are seeing a different view going forward in terms of the relationship that should exist between trade unions and the state. It may be that this is a fresh and a different look, and that we therefore have not to come down on these young persons, give them a chance first before we realize where they may be going. So I think we need to discuss whether IR provides an immune function in our society in the same way that the legal system does. I see the legal system, because when we're talking about systems theory, we're talking about really a concept that is based on the entire human body of the system. And as you know, we have certain parts of our body that perform immune functions and help us be able to survive. The legal system is an immune function. Where wrong things go, then the immune system or the legal system tell you to put them right. Because if you had a society where people would break the law and do everything and not be punished, the legal system would not be there to bring that immunity to deal with the problems, the boils, and the breaks, and the cankers, and so on. We allow the legal system to be our immune system in a very important way. And should we see the industrial relations system as equally an immune system when it deals with where you have problems in the economy, etc.? Should the industrial relations system bring that approach to it also, that it is a problem-solving approach that we can expect from our industrial relations system? And we need therefore to look at things like one of the biggest boils that you can have in the industrial relations system, the strike, industrial action, like stalling. How do we treat that? There are some people who believe that that is the best expression of industrial relations. That people can march as much as they like, strike as much as they like, and so on. But there's another perception. There's another perception that that is a threat to the system, and that there must be some immune activity to keep it within control. Nobody's talking about getting rid of action, but it's a matter of how it is controlled within the economic system, within the political system, the social system. Have we been paying enough attention to the government institutions? The Labor Department, where is it? Personal Administration Department. And can we say that they have adjusted to suit the times in which we live? And have we put them under the scrutiny that's required? And finally, I said we have to discuss the role of industrial relations in the context of globalization and competitiveness. For years, when I read the competitiveness index, as it speaks to Barbados, we're locked in between process and innovation. Innovation is the highest stage we can reach. That's where Trinidad is. The only country in the Caribbean is at the stage of innovation. It's Trinidad and Tobago. Barbados is caught moving between process and innovation. And one of the major problems holding us back is the lack of competitiveness, is the lack of productivity. And we have been walking around that without confronting it. And I'm saying that the industrial relations system has a lot to do with whether we are competitive, whether we are productive. And we cannot get away from having a strong discourse on how we are going to frontline, put on the front burner, the issue of industrial relations and competitiveness. So those are my introductory comments. And I hope that as we go through the night, that we'll be able to exchange at this level and between us to have a discourse on Barbados and where we are in terms of industrial relations. Thank you very much.
Okay, colleagues, we know that in order for us to have the full discussion, having looked at the relationships that exist, when we're talking about industrial relations, we're really talking about relationships that exist between the employment relationship pretty much. And we know that in order to examine that closely, we also need to examine it within the legal frameworks. What legal frameworks are there on island to guide our practices? So to be able to discuss that element, Mr. Gollop will now make his presentation for us.
Thank you, Madam Moderator. Mr. Minister and President of C2 SAB, ladies and gentlemen, Principal of the Academy, ladies and gentlemen, I should like to suggest to you that in a society such as ours, which is built on the rule of law, that is the concept which forms the foundation of any society that prides itself on democratic principles and wishes to steer clear of anarchy. In any society that prides itself in the rule of law, we will have to pay very close consideration, very close attention to how the legal structure develops to take into consideration concomitant developments in the industrial relations process. Now, my colleague Bobby Morris spoke about the development of the law over the years, and his question was whether it had sufficiently developed over time or whether it really was essentially the same as it was 70 years ago, and so on and so on and so on. Now, industrial relations throw up very peculiar contracts. The contract between the worker and his employer. And it is a contract that operates at a very, very personal level. And that contract depends significantly on a foundation of mutual trust between employer and employee. Over the years, we have had a doctrine in our courts which was based on what we call the doctrine of wrongful dismissal. It was a doctrine that was founded on what we call the common law. Now, that's not a big concept to understand. It simply means that this was, the common law really speaks of the law which develops, which evolves from practice, from decisions, and so on, as opposed to statute law, what we get arising out of debates in parliaments and resolutions, etc., etc., etc. And over time, there have been supporters of the common law, and there have been supporters of statute law. Those who have supported the common law have said, used for the basis of their support, that it is flexible and it leaves scope for courts to bring initiative into place and to be creative as the exigencies demand. Those of us who support the development of statutory law, support it on the ground that it is certain. It leaves you in no doubt as to what the position should be. So that we have gone through various developments in our system in an effort to put laws on the statute books to encourage the kind of relationship between employer and employee. And the most recent development has been the enactment of an Employment Rights Act. Now, I should like to suggest to all of you, especially those of you who are workers or those of you who are employers, that you should get a copy of that statute and read it. You may be surprised to find that it is written in English, so that it is something that all of you can understand. You don't have to place yourself in any university or academy of any legal academy to understand that statute. It is a statute which is premised on what the law considers to be fairness. Now, the very ethos of that statute is that no employee should be taken out of his job or sent from his job unfairly. And for the first time in our development, our legal development, dealing with employment situations, we have a statute which gives you a good idea of what is meant by the word fair. It does that by showing you what would be unfair. So if you understand what is unfair to a worker, then you have a good idea of seeing what is fair. But that statute has been a very revolutionary piece of social legislation, and the government should be commended for it. I have heard criticisms over the past by various interest groups. You would immediately identify the interest group that would make the kind of assessment which I'm going to speak about. But I have heard a criticism of that statute on the ground that it is too employee friendly. But why shouldn't it be? It is a piece of social legislation. And the aim of any piece of social legislation is to protect the weak from the strong. So that Employment Rights Act sets up a framework for the development of situations which should regulate good employment relations. And in doing so, it sets up various procedures which have got to be followed in an aim to keep a very close association with what is fair. Now, over the years, we've had all sorts of people, all sorts of philosophers speaking about justice, because the aim of this statute is to provide justice for all involved, justice for the employers, justice for the employees. And we've always had to examine what is meant by this magic word justice. And various philosophers have written theories of justice. But one philosopher whom I have taken to heart, a very modern American philosopher, sees justice as fairness. So that The statute, in its framework and all the regulations and the various procedures which it puts in place to regulate the employer-employee relationship, sets a line of fairness so that you can see what is fair for the employer and also what is fair to the employee. So it makes the employer commit himself to certain standards in order for him to meet up fairness to his employee. But it also does the opposite. It gives the employer the right to deal with an employee who has been unfair in his relationship with his employer. So we have got to look very carefully at the development of that statute. My friend Robert spoke about the Employment Rights Tribunal and what has been going on with that tribunal. It started with a lot of confusion, a lot of public criticism. I've not heard much of that these days. Because, in my view, the tribunal has set itself up as a serious institution that is prepared to use the abilities of those persons within its ranks to give effect to this employment rights statute. What you must understand when you hear criticisms of the tribunal, you hear, when they're going to hear the cases from such and such a place, how many cases have been done, and so on and so on and so on. It is not a fly-by-night tribunal. The Employment Rights Tribunal has a very strong legal infrastructure. It can summon witnesses. It can have its summonses enforced through the courts. Its decisions, which have legal loopholes, can be reviewed in a higher court. And the tribunal has the right to create the climate by laying down certain landmarks for the guidance of employers and employees. And we have been trying very, very hard to do that. We have spent a lot of time in training sessions trying to understand the statute and what it requires. We've taken the time to look at what has been going on in Great Britain, for example, where there is a similar tribunal in England, and a country, because England is a country which has been practicing unfair dismissal for years. Our wrongful dismissal is a Canadian construct, but the English courts have been practicing the doctrine of unfair dismissal for years. And we've been trying very hard to take our directions from what has been happening with their tribunals. It is a work in progress. It is still developing. We are learning as we go by, but that happens with every institution, whether it is a court or quasi-judicial institution, what have you. But I would like to assure you that it is in good hands. So, during the course of the evening, I will, of course, have opportunity to reflect on other legal issues which are important for the development of good industrial relations, and we will be pleased to have further discussion with you. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen.
Dr. Corbin.
Thank you, moderator. Minister, and all protocols being established in the essence of time. Personally, thank you for inviting me to this function, and the principal, sorry, Ken, principal, principal, again, thank you for inviting me. So I want to start with a quote from Martin Luther, going on from what Hal has said, and that is about the issue of justice. Martin Luther King had a quote which said, "True peace is not the absence of conflict, but the presence of justice." I think it is very relevant to trade unionism and labor management or industrial relationships that if you want peaceful industrial relations or peaceful labor management relations, the issue of justice, as Hal has said, is something that is important. So, considering time, try to be brief, moderate at least 5 minutes. And there are 4 areas I want to focus on very briefly, and they're overlapping with Bobby and with Hal. And one, the issue of, I think it is an issue of managing change. So the topic is looking at the evolving trade unionism or trade union movement and looking at future issues. And I think it's a matter of change and managing change and how the unions and employers adjust to a changing work environment or international environment or Barbados environment. And the second is that of traditions. What traditions do we hold on to, and at what point do we move on from traditions? Third point is that of issues pertaining to labor management relations, and the 3B to that would be what Hal just spoke about, so I wouldn't go into detail. I think the Employment Rights Act is something that each Barbadian needs to be aware of, each employee. But I think even employers and unions need to be aware that it is statute, it is law, so you can't ignore it. It has to be understood that it exists. So when there are disputes and conflicts, I think unions need to understand how they can negotiate the conditions or the guidelines or regulations under the Employment Rights Act. And the final thing would be that of the social partnership, and whether it is still relevant, and whether in terms of an evolving trade union movement or evolving trade unions for the future, whether there's a role for the social partnership. And I think the issue of trade unions and how they evolve, I think, will be hinged upon the national vision for Barbados, and I think it is linked to where Barbados wants to be in the future. Because if we have the concept of a social partnership and trade unions and industrial relations is part of that, and we want industrial peace, and we want justice, it has to be linked to a wider vision for Barbados. Where do we want Barbados to go? And as a subset, that would be, what is the nature? I think Bobby was mentioning things like that. What would be the nature then of the industrial relations environment? So that's my first point, the issue of change, and I think it's an issue of change. And I normally tell people, I've heard you talk about voluntarism, and whether voluntarism is dead, whether we still have it. But I think, I always tell people, people down the road because of cars and driving cars fast. Currently, the most safe vehicle on the road used to be the donkey car. I don't think they have ever had a fatality on a donkey car. So because the donkey car is the safest vehicle on the road, you don't abolish cars. So the point I'm making, folks, over time we move from the donkey car to sophisticated computerized vehicles. So in short time, the concept of a mechanic will die. It will only be the very old vehicles that were driven by pure mechanics. But most modern cars are driven by computers, and to fix them, you need to understand autotronics, which is sophisticated computer technology that drives cars. So even persons who were mechanics to survive in the modern world, other than you just fix old cars, you need to change the way in which you do things. So I think for unions, the challenge for unions is an issue of change, and the challenge for employers is also an issue of change. They need to change to adjust to the new regulations and guidelines governing the industrial relations, or I prefer to say labor management relations. And I think that's an issue, and we know the thing about change, right? It's very difficult. If I invited you here tomorrow, 90% of you will sit in the same chair you sat in, right? And that is true. Most people feel comfortable, and when you repeat it, you just continue the behavior. And I want to go on to Bobby, what Bobby said, and this is a concern I have for Barbados generally, and that is for the industrial relations situation now. That I'm hearing people talking about the traditions, that we need to maintain the traditions. But the question I pose this evening is, do you hold on to a tradition because it is a tradition that worked well in the past? Because each tradition that helped you for 50 years could be your downfall in the next 50. And why I'm saying this, folks, I will say this and juxtapose it against the Right Excellent Arabara, who went to my alma mater. He went to LSE, London School of Economics, where I went to. But I suppose you will know that he and Lee Kuan Yew and a whole set of other great thinkers in the 60s, they had a vision for developing societies that were democratic socialists. And Bobby, nowadays, if I've been thinking, Bobby, you know, nobody mentions the word democratic socialism anymore. They're afraid to say that. But one time, both parties in the 70s would openly say we're democratic socialists. But folks, the point I want us to understand about the labor relations and labor management relations, folks, is a trajectory. I don't know if you all realize, in the 60s, Lee Kuan Yew used to seek advice from Arabara. Bobby knows this history better than me. And Singapore is going to be 50, when is it going to be 50, Bobby? Folks, listen to me very carefully. I'm saying industrial relations is about labor management relations and how Barbadian workers are able to work in a peaceful and housing and an environment of trust and justice, so people are productive, and Bobby said competitive, and they are competitive. So folks, check what happened. In the early 60s, Lee Kuan Yew and Arabara were at LSE, and they left and had similar visions for their countries. And Lee Kuan Yew saw advice from Arabara. We need to know that. Folks, today, 50 years after, when you look at the trajectory for Singapore and where it is, even though we know the political system is different, they don't change governments as we do. But when you look at the growth and development of that society, and I know a lot of public service in Barbados go there to look at the models of practice. Singapore is an extremely sophisticated, maybe first world country with a very high standard of living. Now, if Lee Kuan Yew saw advice from Arabara, the Right Excellent Arabara, 50 years ago, and Singapore is so advanced, what happened to us, Barbados, over the last 50 years? And this vision, we know we want that path, the same trajectory as Singapore. And I'm putting it to you, colleagues, I think the challenge of change and industrial relations, I prefer to say labor management relations, because it's just about the ways in which, as Hal said, truly, there is a relationship between the employee and the employer that is there. The employer cannot give up his or her responsibility. Which comes to the other point I want to make on my second point of labor management relations, which is something I have not heard in the debate recently. And that is, in the absence of conflict, if an employer does what he or she is supposed to do, and conflict is reduced to almost zero, what then is the role of the union? Let me repeat, if employers do whatever they're supposed to do, and they have systems and cultures of justice and fairness, and they begin to treat their employees as they should do, and conflict is reduced, and Bobby is correct, if you study your industrial relations, you know one of the things that trade unions strive on is the presence of conflict because of injustice. So what do unions do if employers do what we want them to do to become better employees, which goes now to my fourth point about the social partnership, which goes beyond just waiting for conflict to occur for unions to intervene. So we have conflict-based unions. There's a problem, we fix it. So I will use an example for education, and I have a concern for unions in education. So most unions in education are fighting for the rights of their workers and conflict, but unions in the education unions now have to focus on their concern for the education system, for teaching methodologies. Are they relevant? They need to be concerned that we spend millions of dollars on education, but there are only 2 schools that get 90% of Barbados scholarships and exhibitions. So we need to be concerned, what about the thousands that go to the community college? Right, Bobby used to be, I met Bobby as my history teacher, brilliant guy back in them days, and Bobby, that was about 10 years ago, right? So folks, what I'm saying to you, unions need to evolve beyond just negotiating conflict to be part of the development process. So I'm challenging the teachers union to move beyond conflict and be part of the development of an education system that has significant flaws. So folks, my view of the future unions would be, you need to understand the employment. As Hal said, it is law. You need to understand how to negotiate it. Voluntarism can exist even in light of having the law, but I think even employers and unions need to know how are we going to negotiate it. Where does voluntarism remain within a labor management relationship within the organization? And at what point do we know we need to transition to allow the process to happen through the chief labor officer and then to the tribunal, and we abide by the rulings of the tribunal? So, Madam Chair, these were some of the key points I wanted to highlight very briefly. I hope they were significant. And I begin by saying, folks, I think, again, nationally, I believe unions, if they are going to be sustainable for the future, unions now need to ensure that their strategic visions and their strategies are focused on the national vision for Barbados, and not just for workers, because workers make up Barbados. So if the unions are focused on the national vision, what Barbados wants to be in the next 50 years, we try then to move beyond just resolving conflicts to work in a social partnership where we are true partners, where the government has a role, the private sector has a role, and the public sector has the role, and the unions representing the workers would be part of a developmental process and not just be seen as coming there to resolve conflicts, but unions working more collaboratively with employers to make sure that they do the right thing and that you don't come when there is a problem. You understand what I'm saying, folks? Fixing a problem is that, in other words, something has happened and you try to fix it. I think the modern bar, that's just a waste of resources. We need to have now we need to have the public sector, government offices and private businesses being proactive, because we care about Barbados and we want to make sure that the dream that Barbara had many decades ago, that Barbados can become one of the most sophisticated societies, that I still believe Barbados can achieve it, and that's a role again unions have to play, part of a developmental process. I think they have the skills, they have the highly qualified people, I think they care about Barbados, but I think, colleagues, that transition of change I think is the challenge, because I think it's an issue of tradition, right? That people are so locked into tradition that it's very difficult to change. And I will challenge you folks, anybody who does something the same way year after year, I say no more. Thank you very much.
Now, there is a tendency when we talk about industrial relations to focus a lot, perhaps our first thought is what takes place in the private sector. But I would like the panelists to give consideration to the peculiarities of the industrial relations as it is practiced and its impact on the public sector, because there is, I think, considerations, things that we have to look at to see the differences between those two sectors. So I'll ask Hal to start with the differences as they obtain in the private sector and the public sector when we're talking about industrial relations.
Thank you, Madam Moderator. Now, one has to be very, very careful how one assesses the relationships between these various sectors, employer and employee, because there's a fundamental difference. In the private sector, there is a simple contract of employer and employee. Massey is the big one now.
Yes.
As an employer with his employees, who can all, at the appropriate occasion, complain to the courts that they have been unfairly dismissed. Of course, now they can come through the tribunal. That sort of contract between employer and employee in the private sector is very, very uncomplicated and very easy to understand. In the public sector, it is not the same. Now, when we speak of the public sector, and we speak of public workers, we have two types of public workers. Public workers, generally speaking, are all those people who draw their earnings, who are paid through the consolidated fund. Public workers, they're all public workers. But within that large category called public workers, we have civil servants, who are persons who are employees that appear on a civil list. And we have employees of statutory boards. Now, the statutory boards are legal persons themselves. You can sue a statutory board for unfair dismissal, just as you can sue a private sector employer. As a matter of fact, it is clearly expressed in the Employment Rights Act that it relates to members of statutory boards, but it does not relate to the civil servants, properly so called. So what happens with civil servants? In the Ophelia King case some years ago, you remember the salary cut case of the 90s? The Barbados courts confirmed a very old principle that there is no contract of employment between the state and its employees. They say the relationship is one of status, so that if a civil servant complains that he's been unfairly dismissed, he has to go through what is called a constitutional motion. And he has to go to the court and make an application based on the Constitution of Barbados under section, I think, 16. One of those sections in the 11 to 23, that he has been deprived of property. So that is a totally different process from what somebody, for example, at NCC can say. He can say, I've been unfairly dismissed and I want the Chief Labour Officer to intervene, and if necessary the Employment Rights Tribunal, or he can go straight to court. That's a matter for him. But you've got to understand that relationship between the state and its two categories of employees, and that may be contrasted against what happens in the private sector, where there is a straightforward employer-employee relationship. Now, when one looks at what has been happening in the recent times, in the recent past, with trade unions and flexible muscles and so on and so on and so on. There are certain very important considerations that have to be taken into account. In any society based on the rule of law, and when there are legal principles aimed at producing results within that context of the rule of law, there is always set procedures. There are set procedures laid down to get those results. And very clearly, the statutory guidelines lead to a process which suggests that you exhaust all available remedies before taking the ultimate action. Now, that principle was clearly established in a case that went all the way to the Privy Council, all the way to the Privy Council, where a public servant, a civil servant properly so-called in Trinidad, a teacher, was transferred from his job to a place where he was a trouble tree. So you know how we punish trouble trees. They sent him from Port of Spain to work in San Fernando. Now that is not like sending a man from say Philip to St. Lucie. You get there in half an hour. And he thought that he should pursue a constitutional action against the state. And he went straight for the action which we call judicial review. Judicial review simply is the process where a person complains that a discretion has been unreasonably exercised. He doesn't say that the person doesn't have the discretion to exercise. He's saying that it was exercised unreasonably, unfairly, illegally, something of the sort. So he went straight for judicial review, and the court said, oh no, you go right back down the road and you follow the processes, you exhaust all of those remedies before you come up here. So those are considerations that will crop up when you look at public sector employment, especially if that public sector employment touches on the civil service properly so-called. If it is the statutory board, no problem. So we've got to be cognizant of dichotomy, if one may call it that, between private sector and public sector. My friend Robert Bobby was the head of a union which had its clientele, which drew its membership almost essentially from the private sector and other areas of government where there were simple employment contracts. Now, it is not so easy, on the other hand, with those other unions which deal with civil servants. And there has to be a level of sensitivity, and as Eddie says, a level of acquaintance with what the law is. As I said earlier, if we are to have a society based on the rule of law, any proper legal document, any statute is going to see to it that anarchy should not set in. So built into that statute will be regulations that will take you from point A to point B or to point F. But it will do that very carefully, take you through A, B, C, D, E, F. It will not allow you to jump from point A to point F. If that happens, it is a bad statute. It's a bad statute. So these are considerations which we should take into account when looking at private sector, public sector employment, and how they differ, and how, for example, the employer and employee relationship in those two sectors can operate, again, to meet that desired fundamental of providing justice for all. Thank you, Aaron.
Ambassador Morris, would you like to come in?
I would like to stress, as Hal has done, the reality is that the public sector industry relations is almost all about regulation. Public sector labor management relations is highly regulated. So when we talk about voluntarism in the overall system, there is more voluntarism in the private sector than in the public sector. And we can define what we mean by voluntarism, except the establishment of laws, basically, to regulate. But even in the private sector, there are 5 different types of law, completely different types of law, that help to regulate labor management relations. And one set of those laws really looks at industrial relations. Set up the Trade Union Act, the Better Security Act, those kinds of things, Labor Department Act and so on. Those are industrial relations laws. But then you have the Social Security legislation, is another type of regulation that gives you things like pensions and so on, national insurance and what have you. And that impacts all workers. There are regulations that look at terms and conditions. In fact, I would say to you that 90% of the collective agreements that I have done for 30 years as a negotiator, many of them were packaged in persons' individual contracts anyhow. Normally when you go to work, they give you a contract, and that contract is based a lot on regulations. Maternity Leave Act, Holiday Pay Act, all those things are in your contract. And they come straight out of laws that exist. And if you're good trading, you know sometimes to get better than what the law says. Because the law says you're done in 3 or 4 weeks, but you can get 5 or 6 laws. Well, it can get better than the law, but it can't get worse. But a good trader knows how to do things that are not in the law. Alternatively, it's not in the law, but you negotiate for that. Or compact leave. So a really good negotiator looks for the things that are not in the law that he can introduce to collective bargaining and hope that one of these days they become part of the law. Because once they're not part of the law, only the persons who are covered with that contract will benefit from it. But if you put it in the general regulation, that's what people will get. But when you look at things like the Public Service Act, that is virtually a code. It's virtually a code of industrial relations for the public sector. And I am not convinced, quite frankly, that the practitioners in the public sector pay as much attention as they should to the regulations that determine their realities. And for those private sector unions that are operating in the public sector, because their bias is private sector, they need to train their people to look at public sector realities. It's very important. I'm making the point that both the private and the public sector industrial relations or labor management relations are heavily regulated. And when we look at voluntarism, we look at a number of things that are left out of regulation, allowed to some extent to the partners in terms of what they can do. But we must not go away with the impression that our labor management system is based on voluntarism. We should test the force. That's what voluntarism is about. Putting my test of strength against your test of strength. We are not controlled by law, and therefore we are free to do certain things. Barbados, as my friend said, it's on the rule of law, basically. And the whole result of the industrial relation should be establishing rules. John Dunlop again, at the end of the whole thing, you want to have rules, whether they're rules that take the form of statute, or collective agreement, or however else they come. Because in the long run, we cannot be left just to the whims and fancies of individuals. But I would make the final point, as they say, that for instance, do you know that the right to strike as given in the Public Service Act does not have a private sector comparison? It is a strange thing. Because that act was really negotiated, and this is an interesting thing. That act was negotiated, and there was a powerful trade union influence on that act. So in the public sector, workers have a right to strike. In the private sector, you don't have that right. Thanks to a man called Hal Gollop because for years, Ronnie Adams would not allow the right to strike to go into any legislation. He didn't even believe in peaceful picketing. He said that's anomalous. You can't picket and be peaceful. He didn't believe in these things. Put them in. But what he did, he put in certain immunities. He gave certain immunities that if you took part in what I call a legal strike, because that's something you also have to look at, because all strikes are not legal strikes. But if you took part in a legal strike, then you will be given immunities against various torts that cannot be brought against you. And that is the status in the private sector now. I don't have to remind you what happened down in Broad Street a couple of years ago. Yes. And down in St. James at Sandy Lane. Don't want me to remind you of those things because you know very well. So it is a lot because people don't understand the legal background in which they are operating. And I believe that we have to look at our laws. That is one of the focal points that we're going to have to look at. And finally, my own prediction is that labor management relations in the public sector will become more trying than in the private sector. Let me repeat. I believe that the issue, especially of action, industrial action and so on, in the public sector is going to be more problematic than in the private sector. And if that is so, it means that we have to look at that public sector in order to see what needs to be done in order to bring it to a level that it does not become a problem and a burden in terms of the maintenance of peace in country Barbados.
All right, thank you. Just nothing much to add other than to just support my fellow panelists on the issue. On the issue of the existing regulations within the public service, and that the fact that the public service, civil service, whichever you prefer to call, is not covered within the Employment Rights Act. And obviously there's a reason for that. He didn't even mention the general orders, and I am sure when I used to be a unionist, and Alfred would know that, I know the NUPW, going back many decades, were calling for amendments made to the general orders. I know when it was in the public service, 70s, early 80s, it was a big thing back then, and I don't think we have actually made any significant changes or amendments, so I think that is something we need to look at in a modern Barbados. But moderator, I want to speak to an issue that I think it would be remiss of me not to speak to. It's a sensitive issue, an issue that the unions don't need to speak about, but I think it's a major issue impacting on the future of unions. Unions are calling for the issue for employers to sit, and it's not a criticism, I think it's an issue that the unions need to resolve. You're telling employers, we still conform to a voluntarist tradition, we need to sit down and talk through our issues. We have the unfortunate situation in Barbados, and my friend Cedric, we have a very unfortunate situation in Barbados that needs to be resolved for the future of trade unions, right? And that right now, C2SAB, there's a problem with C2SAB. We can't pretend it away. We can't put ourselves in the sand and hope it disappears. Right now, the principle that unions follow, they are not adhering to when it comes to C2SAB. And the principle is, they argue with the employer, no matter how complex the issue, if you follow the voluntarist tradition, we need to sit down and talk through complex issues. And I believe the social partnership back in the 90s, when we had those challenges, it was successful because even though we were in the deepest problems and pay cuts, Barbados, whether you were BLP, DLP, we realized, workers realized, we needed to work together to help Barbados. Unfortunately, this is going into about 3 years, my average, that there is a schism in the unions where we know there's a fracture, where there is one union that is not part of C2SAB in a formal way. For the future sustainability of unions and for your own, maybe your unions' consistency in the arguments you bring to the employers, you need to sit down. And I am calling today for the leaders of the NUPW, the BWU, even the teachers' unions, any union, to sit down and talk, follow the principles you call on of voluntarism to heal. Because if you do not, in quick time, if you do not sit and heal your differences and allow C2SAB to be the National Congress as it was intended, you are sending a very dangerous message to the employers. I repeat, you are sending a very contradictory message to the employers, that we demand that you sit and talk with us about the most complex issues to be resolved, but we as unions, we don't have to sit down and resolve any matter. We can have this schism or division go on indefinitely. And I know it's an uncomfortable thing that unions don't need to speak about, but I'm not here to be popular tonight. So my buddy Cedric, we've been around, and maybe we're in the union, you think, going back many years. And I mean, my background is strong unionism. I always tell people that I am neither pro-employee or employer. My thing is, and Bobby can tell you, most of my younger years in public service, I was a staunch unionist. I spent so much time at the Barbados Workers Union, Labour College, doing all kinds of courses and labour management courses. So my whole belly is in the trade union movement. I lived it. I'm not an academic in it. I lived it for many, many years. Right? So my heart is still in the trade union movement. So I know when you open the papers tomorrow, they're going to pick up the things to criticize me and lambaste me. But the point is, Cedric can tell you, my heart is in the trade union. I served a long time in it. My navel string is in the union still. And because I care about the union and the future of the unions, it is a matter, folks, that we cannot hide and pretend it away. Thank you very much.
Thank you, panelists, for the thought-provoking, and I'm sure the contributions thus far have really piqued our interest and have our thoughts churning over. And at this point then, I open the floor to members of our audience who may have burning questions as a result of anything that you may have heard thus far. We are now opening the floor for your questions. Just indicate by show of hands and we'll recognize you. There's a gentleman in the back in the plaid shirt. Mr. Watts, after. Just ask you to give your name.
All of you can hear me.
Use the mic, Pastor, please.
Thank you. Can you hear me now? Yes. I listened attentively to the panelists, and I've enjoyed being here this evening. Can you hear me now? Oh yes, I think you can. Yes, I thank you for having me here this afternoon. I want to thank the panelists for having us, and it's very educational. But I need to get my friend, the attorney at law, Mr. Hal Gollop, to define between statute book and common law. The two confuse me. I'm a layman, so I need that definition. When you have it on the statute book, and when you have it on the common law book, and I will listen to your answer. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Watts. I've been a teacher all my life, so I shall endeavor to simplify. We speak broadly of law. Law is what a court will enforce. By saying, so-and-so is the law. Your question focuses on how we got to the point that a court can say, this is the law. Now, our legal systems, based on the English, these legal systems have turned up the two branches of the law, the common law and the statute law. They say broadly that the common law is that area of the law that is common to all people. Now, but how has it come together as a body of law? Courts make decisions, and there's what we refer to as a doctrine of precedent. Now, that's not a big word. The doctrine of precedent simply says that if something has similar facts, it would be decided to the one before it. If it has similar facts to one that has already been decided, you will decide that one similarly. So similar cases are decided similarly. Now, when that happens a few times, you have already developed a stream of law where you can say, every time a man does A, B, C, D, E, or F, the courts will rule that a certain result would be given. Now, that is one area how the common law develops. That is developed through the courts, by judicial decisions, by custom. It has been the custom for people to do A, B, C, D, E. All the people in this village have been accustomed doing this for years, as we say in the law, from the time when the memory of man runneth not to the contrary. So that goes all the way back down to 11 something. So the ancient and consistent practice would eventually give it the status of law. And these practices then, these decisions, these customs, develop that body of law known as the common law. It is not written down anywhere in a volume, but you will find it in law reports, you will find it in decisions of the courts, and places of that nature. Now, on the other hand, we have statute law. Statute law is the creature of Parliament, where you have a bill coming before the chamber. It goes through the readings, it goes into committees, it goes through the whole process, and then it is voted upon, and if the membership finds it favourable, it is sent off to the Governor General, where he gives it his assent, and it is what we call a statute written down in a document, so that you can go and pick it up and say, Section 5.3 of the Employment Rights Act says A, B, C, D, or F. So a statute then, the statute law, can be found in documents called statutes. They have been enacted in Parliament. But the point I made earlier was that some people say the statute legislation forming statutes makes the law very rigid, and they prefer the common law, where the courts have greater flexibility to be creative. But there's the other contention, that because of the nature of a statute, you can pick it up in a document and read it quite clearly. As I said earlier, in our jurisdiction, all of them are written in English. It makes the law certain. So that's the distinction between these two streams of law. The one, the common law, being flexible, and judges being creative, some more creative than others, can create law by their decisions. But when there is a statute, it is slightly different. Now, but a very important point which you have to make, which you must take hold of, is that the common law cannot override a statute. The common law must give way to the statute once there is an enactment to deal with that same principle of law. So as soon as you make an enactment of a particular piece of legislation, all the previous law goes through the window. All of it. So that, Comrade Watts, I hope I have helped you to understand. Now, my friend at my left facetiously is a trade unionist, you see. But I always say trade unions are lawless institutions. My friend here just said behind me, protocols can trump statutes. Well, okay. Oh, yes. But that is an important observation, because protocols generally are gentlemen's agreements, which depend on the goodwill of the persons involved. It depends on good faith, so that if bad faith sets in, a protocol can be destroyed, where people do not follow the protocols. And again, the point we've been making here, protocols are based strictly on regulations. They have a strong regulatory background, and you move from regulation A to regulation B as the protocol directs. You do not get from A to Z and do not go through B, C, D, E, F, G, or L, M, N, O, P, and so on. And that is one of the very important things about protocols. They are agreements between parties that they would observe certain rules and regulations. Thank you.
Just a reminder to give your name and the person to whom you are addressing your question.
My name is Alex Wade. I just addressed the whole panel, actually. Very interesting discussion. Somehow, in the beginning, you talk about justice and, of course, fairness, and seem to move away from that. But I just want to say that there will always be conflict for the simple reason that you're dealing with human beings. Yes. And yes, you do want change, and you need change at both levels. You need changes in terms of the union, maybe the whole union mindset, but you also need changes in terms of the government or the private sector mindset as to how they relate to workers. And you must have justice and fairness. And yes, there's a process, but the process must seem to be fair and just and timely. If you have an extension, if you have a delay in the execution of serving the rights of the workers, of the people that make up the country, there will be problems. There will be problems. And I think that I just wanted for people to note that, because I was getting a sense that there tends to be this idea that unions almost are becoming irrelevant, and that has been a trend. And that's been a trend I've noticed whether it's in England or Canada or whatever. And there's obviously an attack on the unions, but the unions represent the workers, and you need to have unions in order to do that. So I just want to have your response to that, because I think it's very important that people understand that unions are very important, and union leadership have to understand, of course, that yes, they have to change, they have to adapt, but not to the point where they almost, how should I put it, make the workers almost become irrelevant, the rights of the workers. So we have to be very careful. It's a path that I have noticed that's very important for people to understand, that the unions are important, the leadership of the unions are important, and there has to, of course, be a collaboration. That whole idea of collaboration is important, but it has to be done in a timely fashion. Thank you.
Or if I can just give my response. One, that, as I said in my presentation, I truly believe that Barbados had and still has a very unique concept called the social partnership, and it can only be refined to be better to work in the interest of Barbados. And So I believe there's a role for unions, and as you said rightfully in your summation, really, the unions, the employers need to evolve. But our move this evening was to look particularly at unions and the unions for the future. And that's the point I was making, that if you know, I don't know if you know the history of the trade union movement in Barbados, but for many years, leaders there were other countries in the Caribbean that had trade union congresses, and Barbados stood out as being one of the few countries in the Caribbean that did not have a trade union congress, right? Bob, you would know the history, right? The Right Excellent Sir Frank Walker was of the view that the BW was indeed the trade union congress, right? And he would have stated that formally. So I think the event where you had a creation of a trade union, a C2SAP in itself was really a milestone when you know the history of the trade union movement and persons who were calling for this Congress. And I think it is something that it really was good and added value to the trade union movement in Barbados. And I believe what you're talking about, sir, in the future where trade unions become more powerful and are able to evolve, that is where then you are having, even within the concept of a partnership, where you're having the biggest private sector union, the public sector union, the teachers union, you're having them coming together realizing that we are working collaboratively in the interests of the workers, and we as unions also need to show, we can show partnership, and I believe C2SAP in itself is really the epitome of trade union partnership at a national level, right? But I support your point that trade unions are still relevant. Thank you.
Let me say the question of the relevance and the continuity of trade unions really is not a discussion. I always say that somebody's current existence can be your future existence, and therefore we looked at the world. Is there any significant country in the world, including the first world countries, that have evolved beyond Barbados, where the trade union movement does not exist and is strong? If you go to Japan, you have a trade union movement. United States of America, anywhere, I don't even have to list them for you. Where you don't find trade unions are in the least developed countries, where, on the whole, there is a tradition of autocracy and dominance by certain types of leadership, because they have not moved towards the modern era. But in all modern countries, trade unions exist. The issue really is, how does the trade union transform itself and change to be relevant in the period in which it finds itself? That's the fundamental issue. So that trade unions in Britain have had to evolve. The United States of America have had to evolve, and so on. Same thing is true of Barbados. Now, there was a time when the IMF and the World Bank, etc., did not find support for trade unions. That changed in 1992. They came out and they supported trade unions, and they made it very clear that trade union existence is fundamental to things like freedom and peace and to development. Because we concentrate a lot on growth, we don't talk enough about development. So there's not an issue. But what they made clear is that we need trade unions who use social dialogue more than they use other strategies. The strategy of militance and force should be seen as a last resort thing. But the continuing strength of the trade union is in understanding the potential of its members. Its members are citizens. Its members are tied to the workforce. There are employees too. And there are employees before they become members of trade unions. To become a member of a trade union, you are an employee first. And therefore you must have some contact to your employer. As Hal said, that very intimate contract. When you go to work, there's a contract between you and them. You then get a contract with the trade union after. And therefore trade unions have to understand how they work within that relationship. And it is not all about strife. It is not all about conflict. It is about growth and working together to develop at the micro level and at the macro level. You cannot build a workplace if there is constant strife. It just cannot happen. There is more in common between the employer and the employee than something we understand. We concentrate on the narrow areas of difference. What we don't look at is the commonalities that they share. And remember, unison is not the same as unity. But unison is very important. We have to work together. We might not be saying the same thing. We might be united in the sense that the same thing, but we can work together because we share these things. So trade unions that understand that are going to be the backbone of any society in the world. They'll be moving towards strength, integration, building strong societies. That is the role of the trade union. And it depends on the kind of leadership that understands that. Now, if you got your praise as a trade unionist according to the amount of strikes that you led, as against the amount of innovations that you brought about, or the productivity that you drove in the workplace, but certainly you're going to be encouraged to strike. If that is what defines you. And that is what the World Bank and the IMF were saying, that in this period of development, we have to change the way how we recognize persons. I don't want to say this to you. I work with a great man, the late, right, excellent, Sir Frank Walker. I worked beside him as his personal assistant for 10 straight years. And I will tell you, he never saw the strike as a virtue. He used to quote for me what Churchill said: Georgia is better than war. Georgia is better than war. I sat down beside him many times while he coached me. The thing to do, Robert, is to examine the things or research it clearly so you understand what the issues are. Develop a number of strategies and then go there and do it. Do it. When you heard Frank at any time, I mean the late, right, excellent Sir Frank Walker, at any time moving towards industrial action, he used to say also, the threat of a strike is more important than the strike. For people who are so anxious to get their reputation laid on the amount of strikes that they have, including failed ones, to understand that there's another method. There's a method that the World Bank and the others will bring. To what extent did you lead to the development of your country so that it becomes a Singapore? What are you willing to do to make sure that your country becomes first world? That's important in terms of what trade unions have to see about themselves. Thank you.
No, you're older than I am.
It's all right, sir. You go ahead.
I had no idea that I would come to an event that may be a stimulus to take us into the future. And I want to thank you all, okay? Dr. Corbin, you referred to the 90s, okay? Now, there are four men who got together and decided the doom and gloom that existed in 91 with an alleged unemployment rate of 24%. And not too long after that, 2 weeks foreign exchange. 2 weeks foreign exchange. Those men need to be honored above what they've been honored before. Okay? It was Sir Horace King, okay? Sir Roy Tubman, Sir John Stanley Goddard, and the Permanent Secretary in the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, Peter Lorry. They structured a platform, and I was privileged to operate on that platform. It's now Bobby's ministry, okay? It was a ministry that went beyond the perception of the public service. And what was amazing, there was total unity, okay? There are people who had different political loyalties, but we made him chairman of task force, and the loyalty to Barbados came first, okay? And my feeling about it is we need to adopt that model again, okay? Now I'm going to refer to domestic violence to set the tone. I always believe it's gender relationship we should be focused on, not violence, okay? And it was 12th of November last year, I had an amazing opportunity to be honored by being invited to speak at a union called the NUPW. And I said, I'm a trade unionist, because the first 4 years of my working life was a member of the Clerical and Commercial Workers Union. Bobby will tell you, I respect the Barbados religion and when I dealt with, and saw them as a partner to the point where anybody fermented could be artists when they came to Barbados, they will recognize the union. Okay? And you see, my feeling about it is we need to share the ideas and then see how we're going to go ahead. Now, Bobby referred to the fact that the Caribbean, which he now is responsible for, you have no idea how Barbados is held up at the highest level in the Caribbean.
Just a second, please. I hate to interrupt, but there are a number of others.
Yes.
I just want.
So what I think we need to do is not end this at the end of it, but do what we did in the past and then now. Establish a task force, take the ideas and develop a plan of action, which is what we did in the 90s, if we want to get action. And I do want to thank you very much indeed.
Thank you. Simon.
Yes, I am. My name is Simon Ali, President of the Young Democrats. The latter part of the topic always appeals to me, the way forward, speaking to the future. Now, as a young person looking into Barbados 20 or 30 years into the future, we know that as a service-driven economy is important, that eventually we have to operate almost on a 24-hour basis, especially if tourism is going to be still one of our mainstays. Now, one of the challenges that I observed recently is that sometimes it would appear, this is just my opinion, it would appear that the trade union can sometimes be used as a political platform for persons to, of course, launch their own personal agenda rather than sincerely taking care of the needs of workers. His Excellency, Mr. Morris has said that as it relates to strike action is something that should be seen as a last resort and not a first option. The reality of it is that in recent times, we are seeing a situation sometimes where protocol is not observed, and it would appear that because of sometimes their political agenda of some persons, that a destabilizing element has been brought into the society, as it would appear by the union. It would appear that way in more recent times. My question, if we are going forward, as we talk about the way forward in the next 10 or 20 years in Barbados, how do you see the union working and honoring the social partnership as it has been doing in the next 20 years, as our society becomes more advanced technologically, as well as the possible starting of an oil industry, depending on if oil exploration is successful in Barbados? How do you see these new emerging industries impacting on labor relations in the next 20 to 15 years, 15 to 20 years? That's my question.
Simon, my first comment is that one swallow does not a summer make. And the behaviors that we saw, I have not yet been able to say that they constitute a trend. And it's very important when we get into analysis that they don't take one or two instances to be a pattern. Yes, it happened, but I cannot draw a conclusion that that is a set form of behavior that will occur. I can't draw that conclusion. I don't even want to start with it. But your very deep question is how we're going to relate to the future that we will be mainly a service economy, and does that have implications for how we manage our labor management relations? Very, very important. And you talked about the 24-hour existence and so on. I remember leading a discussion at the time the Barbados Labour Party was in office, and I was part of a workshop seminar that dealt with that. I gave it my support. I could not give it the sanction of the Barbados Workers Union, but I gave it my support. And I will say this to you, It does not take a rocket scientist to understand that prosperity is dependent on the use of a number of factors. One factor is the human resource. So the more you improve the human resource, the better your country is going to be. The second one is time. You can do 3 times as much in 24 hours that you can do in 8. It is simple as that. So if we restrict the work day to 8 hours, we can only get 8 hours of output. If we carry it to 16 hours, we will get 16 hours of output. And if we carry it to 24 hours, we get 24 hours of output. Now, it does not mean that every sector of the community will go to 24 hours. In fact, there are some that are already there. Hotels work 24, you can't do less than that. The police work 24, the hospital work 24. But it does not mean that you're going to move everything to 24. But we cannot afford to allow, because I'll make a point here, it might be criticized for it, but I will make the point. A trade union, to some extent, like a school, is a conservative institution. Hal and I were 13 years ago together. We did all the theories, etc. A school is to maintain what they understand of the cultures and values that they think are important in society. They very seldom think about changing. But it's the school that changes that brings real value to your country. Curriculum. I remember fighting to get Latin off the curriculum at foundation school because the Latin scholars didn't want to give up. So people hold on forever. You have to change. Trade unions are very conservative. And trade unions do not let go of easily things that they've fought for a very long time. So they'll work for reduced hours. That's the thing that they've always talked about. You know, going back to the very early nights of labor, it said it was the 8-hour day. That is what started their day. Understand that that has been one of the signature things that they fought for. And it was important at that time because they were fighting against a kind of dehumanizing behavior in the factories, the smokestack factories. It's a different thing when you're working in hotels, etc. And it's a different time. My proposal, Simon, is that we have to get into serious negotiation. The time for discussion is over. True. You move, listen, there are different forms of dialogue, social dialogue. You talk, you discuss, you argue, you consult, but when you get down to something called negotiation, there's a fundamental stage of social dialogue. And we really have to put 24/7 under negotiation and work out an agreement. These are the things we will do, these are the things that we will not do, this is where we will do it, this is where we will not do it. But we can't just bring it up, dump it, come back the next 10 years, bring it up, dump it. It's not sure that we've reached the level of sophistication that I know that we are at. There's nothing that we cannot negotiate because we have the capacity to do it, to make sure that the workers are not badly treated, but that the country is better for those changes. That's my position, sir.
Cedric Murrow, the President of the Congress of Trade Unions and Staff Associations. You know, when I left home this evening in St. Philip, I said this will be an evening that I will always remember, and it is turning out to be that way. Because certainly contributions that we've had from our esteemed panelists, Ambassador Morris, Mr. Gollop, and Dr. Corbin, have really taken us on a journey on a number of themes to explore what I would call the topic of whether trade unionism in Barbados. I just want to make a couple of observations, but obviously because the question that I want to ask was directed to Roger. He's coming back. He's back. Yes. But you know, Eddie, and we'll call you Eddie because I've known you, as you said, from well, but Akhentoolove. Next month, not next month, sorry, in October, Singapore, who is celebrating their 50th anniversary as we speak, 50th year, has invited the Minister of Labour, myself, and the head of the private sector to Singapore to discuss the social partnership and tripartism as practiced in Barbados. So your point about Lee Kuan Yew 50 years ago, seeking to speak to the right excellent Elvira about a way forward, so to speak, they would be looking on and reflecting on what we have done, but to some extent we'll also try to project with regard to the way forward. I think it is important though for us, given what has transpired over the last few months, to realize that every time in our history of periods of what I would call deprivation or change of sorts, we have had flare-ups in society, and the unions are part of that. I recall as a young person in NUPW with yourself, in the early to mid-80s, a general strike by the NUPW. But we had preceding that, the national strike involving David Giles. We would also have had with the NUPW a nurses' strike. We also would have had significant agitation about the changing of sick leave. And those are three that I just called to mind. Just upon the cusp of 85, we had a sanitation strike. I come to the 90s. And let me say that period between 81 and 86 would have been characterized by the IMF being in Barbados coming in 1981. 1991 to 1991. And recall that we had the massive demonstrations about the public sector, followed by a number of other smaller strikes in the private sector. Again, a period when there was a tumult. What we have witnessed recently, in my view, is a characterization of that same kind of thing. We will see whether it can go on any further. Because it is my view that we in Barbados have a common sense approach to a lot of these things. And so I am not worried in terms of the climate getting worse. What I'm concerned about is what Comrade Morris raised, and it has to do with how are we going to get Barbados into a truly productive and competitive country. True. And we as unions have a fundamental part to play in that. And it cannot be slavishly holding on to what we have gained, but looking to see how we can use that within the national context to move forward to greater gains. Because what we think we have gained, we can always lose if we don't understand that the only way we're going to move forward is if we are able to develop the sum total of our productive capacity to engender growth. And so that is by way of the comment that I wanted to make. And now that Ambassador Morris is back, I would want Ambassador, you made a statement which intrigued me. And I had to write it down because I come from the public sector, though I no longer work within it. And you said industrialization, the public sector will become more problematic than in the private sector. That may be a topic for another panel discussion. But certainly I want you to just expand upon it a little more. Thanks.
Thank you. We just had to make a break and come back. I've been, as I said, I like to look at trends. It's very important you start looking at trends, because if you're planning and you don't understand the trends, then you come with the plans that are inappropriate. And Simon alluded to what is happening within the economic sector. I remember I started out by saying that we're looking at things like collective power and dispute resolution, so the processes of industrial relations. But we have to look at things like the context, the legal context, the economic context, etc. The economic context of Barbados is going in a direction where there are going to be less large businesses and more small and medium-sized enterprises. That's the history where we're going. That's very, very clear. All right? So the government will become always, it will remain a very large employer of civil servants as well as of public servants. So government is the area where labor management becomes more important. Even in terms of your large private sector operations, they're going to be either global companies or Caribbean companies. You need to understand, Trinidad has a totally regulated labor management environment down the industrial code. And Trinidad controls a lot of the private sector in Barbados. If you look at what has happened to places like Sugar, the Poor, Cable and Words, or Lime name them, etc., and how the trade unions are being dealt with, basically, you recognize that the private sector trade union has a lot of work to do to maintain itself. So the focus and the strength will be in teachers' unions because they'll be secure in who they are, etc., and public servants, etc. And they still feel they can go back to places like the sanitation service and bring them out to do work that is really destabilizing the country, etc., because they feel that they have that power, they have control over these things. But it's not only Barbados. You've got the United States of America. It is really the public sector trade unions, because the private sector has been knocked down to a very large extent, maybe 7%, while in the public sector you're about 14%, etc. So I'm just looking at trends and what's going to happen. And it therefore means that you have to prepare yourself, understanding those trends, and prepare yourself for a better handling of labor management relations in the public service. I'm not saying this is a bad thing at all. I'm saying it as something that will happen. And I always say, one big problem, as you know, in the public service is that the Labor Department has never seen itself as a conciliator between the state and the state employees. So there's a huge gap. If there's a private sector issue, you send the Labor Department. Yeah. And if you have a good Labor Department with good officers and good laws department and so on, you can get a resolution. But once it is the public sector, because the Labor Department does not handle that, but by law they were supposed to, there was nothing to say that the Labor Department should not deal with public sector disputes. But clearly, if there's a feeling that if you send public sector disputes to a public sector department, it's like going from Caesar to Caesar. There's nothing to say that you cannot have private conciliators. There's nothing to say that you can't set up a college of conciliators drawn from some of your best brains, and they can then conciliate in matters relating to the public sector. You can do that. You need also to make room for mediation. There is nothing in the law in Barbados that deals with mediation and labor management relations. We tried it. We tried an experimental thing again with the Royal Shop and Sandy Lane, but there was no legal basis for it. And the arbitration provisions that we have in the law, you can only go to arbitration if both sides agree. And then the Governor General can call for arbitration. So arbitration has not been used. So we have so many lapses going forward that I'm saying, put in place structures for the public sector. Make sure that your PAD is working, your Ministry of Civil Service is working, etc. Make sure that you train all of your officers in the teachers' union, because again, let us understand, a lot of the public sector unions are what I call not really professional trade unions, in the sense that the people who lead them get there through popularity by a vote, but they're not necessarily going to college and then a master's in labor management relations. So you need to understand that. And sometimes they're volunteer people, they're not people who are paid to do the work. So if you have this sector that is so important, but the people who are running it in terms of industrial relations, and I'm looking at the recent job description put out there for the leader of the NUPW. Well, I'm telling you something, that's serious job description, you know. And it shows that the NUPW is taking their business very seriously. But that is the standard that they can't fall back from now. You see? Because they recognize the importance of the public sector. And they recognize that public sector industrial relations is fundamental to the future of Barbados. So those are my thoughts, Sally, and I believe that once we understand that, and let me add, in the face of possible criticism, that I spent the 1990s, a lot of the 1990s, I spent going through the Caribbean trying to set up trade union centers. That was our mission. It was a mission that came down from Sir Frank and others. That you have to have primary unions, then secondary unions, and then you go right up to the top unions, the international unions. And we've invested so much. And then we had C2SAB. And now there is no C2SAB in the sense that we had C2SAB before. And I'm asking, what is the reason for that? I like to look at systems, as they say. You don't like to look at individuals. You make mistakes when you think about things like personalities, etc. So was there a systems flaw that caused that to happen? And if there has been a systems flaw, then there has to be systems correction. So I think, as my colleague said, it is one of the most important things in Barbados at this time. And the last point I want to make on this is that we have to be careful when we talk about the social partnership. Would you agree with me that, in a real sense, what we're talking about is the government and two social partners? I'm trying to make a distinction. Is government a social partner? Or are we talking about government and two social partners? And think about it then. Think about it. Because the state, you really think about what the state is. The state is the only authority that has the right to tax anybody here. It is the sole authority to make sure that laws go on the statute, but the private sector can't do that nor public sector. And it's the only one that can imprison you and take your life legally. So when we're talking about a social partnership, I like to say that we're really talking about something called corporatism, which goes back from centuries in terms of theory. Corporatism is an intention to bring those three segments of the community. You can bring along the others if you want, to the church and all the others really. But those three fundamental ones, if you get them working in unison, remember, not in unity. If you get them working in unison around a particular philosophy, and this is very important to Akhentoolove. Akhentoolove, we spent the 70s and the 80s talking about democratic socialism, etc. We don't talk about it much because it's become the thing. I think that all parties in Barbados will call themselves democratic socialists, so you don't have to fight and use the language anymore. It is there. I think there's some differences though that we are now seeing creeping in, because Dunlop believes that if you have a single unifying ideology, that helps to drive the society forward. If the society is driven by a number of competing ideologies, then you have problems. So that a unitarist ideology that says the employers don't need any trade union will cause trouble. We don't have that in Barbados. On the other hand, an ideology that pushes what they call scientific socialism, the old Russian thing, and talks against capital all the time. We don't want that either. It makes no sense. And the reality is that is like going back to slavery. If you put yourself in that, if you clothe yourself in an ideology that is based on excluding the private sector and what the private sector has to offer, in my full understanding of the private sector, you're going back to a form of slavery. So our democratic socialism of the two parties allows for a mixed economy. And that is why you're seeing things like public and private sector business deals are becoming the thing. Because we have now reached the level of trust that we can do that. there was a time when nobody would want to think about the public and the private sector doing deals together because it was supposed to be anathema. But that is not so. Nor the days when trade unions were supposed to be the enemy of the private sector and government is the supporter of the trade union. And that can't be the going forward thing anyhow. Government has to work with the private sector, has to work with the trade unions because government has to work with everybody in order to carry our society forward. So we're moving into a new era, setting in the public sector becomes fundamentally where we're going. We can't make mistakes in terms of whom we put to lead the trade union movement in the public sector. It is too big, it is too important. I am not, at this stage of my life, able to make judgments about the young leaders. I am not looking at what happened recently and defining their reality. That might be a start. I will look at the trend as it evolves. And if we see the trend is going the wrong direction, then we correct. Because that is the job of seniors. Those of us who reach this age, thank God, it is our job to be able to look at our mistakes too. And try to stop the young people from going there. Our job is when we see the wrong, correct. But it is not that we are going to try to make them feel small or to put them down. We're not doing that. We're not in our business. Our business is to help them to grow and to be the best that they can be. Thank you very much.
Mr. Robert Morris, I just want to say a few little short words. I'm a fully paid up member of the Democratic Party. I'm Julian Hunt. Can I say a few short words?
Mr. Hunt, there was a gentleman who was waiting before.
I didn't know what he was doing standing up there.
All right, so now you know. Just
can I speak after him?
There's another person.
I want to say a few short words.
Let's not disrupt. Just have a seat. And
is it because I'm a white man? We're just talking about the private sector working together.
We get a chance. We get a chance. Sit down. No, Julian. Let me speak after My name is Mr. Chess.
Yes.
Hello. Yeah. Yes, my name is Mr. Chess. And let me congratulate the panel for such a variety of issues tonight. They touch on public law, they touch on employment law, and they even went so far as talking about industrial relations law. And I have no doubt that the chairman would be delighted to know that I've been looking now at this particular one called the employment law because as my chairman in the Employment Rights Tribunal. What I must say, Mr. Ambassador, is that you look at industrial relations rights. That is akin to what is happening now in the United Kingdom Convention rights. Then we talk about the right to privacy and the right to freedom of expression. Albeit it is in our constitution. What I think now is that in our employment rights legislation, we must look at the issue of this whole concept of social media that is pervading now the workplace. Only a few days ago, I had the privilege to read the case of Leeds in the United Kingdom, where the Employment Rights Tribunal struck down that employee for taking, I would say, the privilege of using social media to bring the organization into dispute. And therefore, we must look at it from our employment rights perspective. I know the time is short. Another issue I would like Mr. Ambassador you touched on is ADR, dispute settlement. I must say that in the Employment Rights Act, we have that mechanism. Where we look at conciliation, we look at mediation, these are the acts say. Pardon? Yeah, but it didn't be. And what it states about is that you must deal with every issue as far as the employee is concerned before you bring it then to the tribunal. And another issue I would also like to look at tonight is that I hope that the chairman, because you mentioned it, Mr. Ambassador, the Employment Rights Tribunal, you heard about all this, but I must say that I have the statistics to give the group there what the chairman and his group is doing in the Employment Rights Tribunal. One case, yes, but there is a number of cases now that is to go before the Employment Rights Tribunal.
And I'm sure that the members here would like to know what is happening in the Employment Rights Tribunal, and I have no doubt that one of them will be on the chairman to do such.
Yes, that's my assistant in the tribunal. You see, when we have that kind of expertise working in that institution, as I said to you earlier, it is in good hands. It is in really good hands. Now, just quickly, we have a number of cases ready for hearing. Because the public must understand that there is a process in which my friend described as a built-in mechanism of alternate dispute resolution, so that the statute sets up the mechanism where a case can go from a complaint through the chief labor officer, where every effort is made to arrive at some form of conciliation. And if that fails, then the chief labor officer makes the report and sends it to the tribunal for hearing. But my friend has given me a list, and we have 9 cases ready for hearing. Those cases are those which the applicants before the tribunal have exhausted all of the remedies available to them. And the chief labor officer has now decided that they should be heard. Now, again, persons do not know because the press doesn't do justice to some of these things, for whatever reason. There are 3 tribunals within the Employment Rights Tribunal. And because of the structure of the tribunal, the way it is set out in the statute, the regulations for the statute, we can have 3 hearings going simultaneously, so that there is no situation where the tribunal is sitting down on matters and avoiding work and giving some cases priority over others. The structure is well set out, and the members of the tribunal have been well trained, and I can assure you that in the months ahead you will be hearing a lot more from the tribunal. Thank you, my friend, my comrade Mr. Chase, a very zealous and competent assistant. We go way back, we cut our teeth in teaching back in the 1960s, 1965, 64, that kind of background. It dates us, so you will know if you've been teaching that in 1964 or 65, you're not young boys anymore. Thank you.
Mr. Gollop or Mr. Can I make a few short remarks now? Good night, everybody. My name is Julian Glenn Hunt, and I'm a fully paid up member of the Democratic Party. For the last 8 years, ever since I have to start the foolishness. Now, first of all, I feel that if I'm a hallowed ground, as in the Bible, where the man had to take off his sandal because it was hallowed ground. Because anywhere that Arabara and the great men who were on the wall was, I feel very, very humble. especially Mr. Robert Morris. I remember coming down Bay Street one time and he was protesting against the telephone company. He said, "Julian, stop, man, we need your help." Never forgot that, Mr. Morris. And he comes to the National Trust and gives some wonderful lectures. The man is a giant in Barbados. Also, Miss Ram is here too, and she promised to come and get some sugarcane juice with her husband in Bay Street, and it never turned up. Sugarcane juice no turn to alcohol. Anyway, the point is that I took a letter to Mr. George Pilgrim today, and I just came back from the National Advocate ticket thing. Some resolutions that I want put forward. There are 7, but I can just mention the ones first that are not controversial. No, I just mentioned them fast. I want the merrymen to be honored. I think that they should be honored.
I've been serving the role of the moderator because you've been very kind to me.
Okay.
And I want to advise Julian that we try to be fair to everybody.
Yes.
But I am getting the sense that you are using this occasion for purposes for which the occasion was not designed.
No.
You were saying no, and I'm saying that is my perception.
All right, let me finish.
And it might be the perception of others, but I'm in the position to tell you what my perception is, what the others are not.
No.
So if you are going to talk to the topic we had tonight, fine.
Yes.
You make it short.
Well,
and otherwise, use another occasion.
Okay.
And another opportunity.
All right, Mr. Robert.
Thank you very much.
My wife is at home dying, and I have to get back home, so I have to be fast.
Thank you very much.
I would like
Thank you very much.
Yeah, I would like to say, right, I'll come to the main point here. I am an Arabara D. That means that whatever Arabara did, I believe is sacred. I believe it's sacred. I don't believe, I'm not a member of the party. The people in the party who say Arabara didn't really know what he was doing. So we have to try and improve.
Julian, you're not doing what it asks you to do.
Well, what you want me to talk about?
You're not speaking to the topic, but you came in late. You see?
Yeah,
so
I didn't know what the topic was.
So we think, quite frankly, to be very fair to all of us, Julian.
But I'm just replying to what the Prime Minister asked. The Prime Minister asked us to come here and tell him the things that we want done.
Not here. Not here. The conference.
Well, all right, I will sit down. But before I sit down, I want to say
thank you very much.
That I don't think it's advisable to spend $30 million to change the Royal Barbados Police Force and the prison service.
Come Sunday.
And everything.
Come Sunday, not tonight.
To change it.
Come Sunday.
All right.
Thank you.
All right. I am not for the getting rid of the Queen.
Come Sunday.
I want the Queen to come here.
Thank you, Madam Moderator. I don't have questions as such for the panel, but I have 2 observations. I'll be focusing on the way forward. As I said in my opening remarks, there's a lot of uncertainty in everything in the past months. And we know, I also said how people were viewing trade unions and members who are fellow workers in a real caustic way. 2 comments I want to relate to would be the whole idea of the relevance of trade unions. It would not be as erudite as Bobby has been. He did a very good job on that. But I also have another slant to it as well. Trade unions will always be relevant. Trade unions will, how should I put it, not be, within a society like ours, I don't want to sound like a scientific socialist, with all the varying contradictions within the social relationships as we understand our societies, the trade union will be as relevant as prisons to the society, and a police force to the society, perhaps even an army to the society. That means, given the nature of how we know societies operate, how power players are acted out, you will always have to have a trade union or some similar institution to oversee the efforts of the rights of workers. So the question of the relevance of the trade union, as Bobby said earlier, to me this exists. And I've always had a problem when it was the activity, trade unions, management and functioning, usually particularly at Labour College. And all due respects to Brother Corbin, Eddie, Akhentoolove, the students used to come to us at the Labour College, to our research department, and they always had this question or this move or this topic to discuss. Trade unions have outgrown their usefulness. I mean, we used to wonder, what would progressive institution at university be sending people with such a simplistic, silly notion about fundamental institution in society? Why can they come like, what more can trade unions be doing, or what more can they do to advance the cause of the working class movement? That's something more philosophical and deeper, but it's just come this simplistic thing. I don't think you sat there with that silly question. I know you because we go back to the movement. I know the differences. So the trade union, and Bobby made, I don't want to go what Bobby said, but he made the point, the relevance of trade unions. Earlier I heard the cry being made for trade unions having to desist from managing conflict to focusing more on national development. Perhaps trade unions are their worst enemies. Perhaps trade unions do not advertise themselves in a positive way. Maybe they advertise themselves threatening less about strike and striking more about strike, as I stated earlier. But for me, that is minuscule. Trade unions and the trade union movement in Barbados is represented, or is given an opportunity to be on so many different boards and committees across this sphere for national development. When I sat as president of Labour College, I used to sit on a committee in the Ministry of Education to advise the Minister of Education. I used to sit on a committee to help select persons for national development scholarships. And all of the senior officers in the union sat on so many varying committees. Coming out of the 1991 scenario, one of the greatest things that ever came out of that, I've been hearing tonight about Bobby is a little modest, he probably wouldn't speak of these things, was the whole thrust of focusing on productivity. That came up. We had a National Productivity Council was set up. And Bobby worked very closely. Ambassador Morris, only Bobby, because we're comrades, we're friends. But you know, there's not necessarily intended. Well, Ambassador Morris worked so closely with the National Productivity Council, and even went to the Caribbean doing seminars, etc. The Labour College, But so he was a critical figure, and by extension the Labour movement, and putting forward the agenda for productivity in Barbados that is still followed to some degree. So every time we the way forward, how better can we intensify these efforts that we've got to talk. Not that it's becoming irrelevant, nonsensical. How much better can we build on these initiatives from the 1990s, etc. Before the 1990s, the Barbados was going to establish a residential Labour College. I had the privilege of heading that college for 10 or 12 years or so as the principal. I worked there before the tutor. The National Union of Public has the academy for practically full-time officers. These are the things the trade union movement does. I had the privilege recently of chairing a committee with the permission of Brother Cedric, reviewing the policy statement of the Congress of Trade Unions and Staff Associations. You know, I was going to bring it with me tonight, I forgot. It's about 39 pages or 40 pages. And CTU has policies on every area of national development you can think of. And they reviewed it. These are things that people need to know about the trade union movement. But as workers maybe have to rattle sabers a bit, or they're focusing on this and they're becoming irrelevant and there's no future for them. Nonsense. So I just thought I'd throw it out. You see, Brother Dennis in the back, General Secretary of the CTU, welcome. And so people need to know these things. People need to know these things. The trade union movement, as it works now and as it impacts the society, is very significant. And if you really get to understand the real work that trade unions do in this society with respect to national development, it will pale into insignificance the few strikes here and few strikes there and the threats that strikes at the second. So if we're looking forward, we got to abandon this whole concept of the trade union movement and recognize that it's going to be here because of the nature of our society, the contradictions of our society that have to have trade unions. They have to be here. So how much better can we work with them? And how much better will we permit them to work within the society? Thank you.
I'm a product of the College and Barbados Union under Bobby Morris, and I am happy to know that I have learned along to the trade union movement. And as Bobby Morris was said, I was a young child then, and I learned a lot, and I was along in the union.
Yes, sir.
Good night. My name is Bert Rochester. When I listened to the debate and what is going on, not only recently, what is lacking is the I don't know how to term it. The idea that the worker, the value of labor to the whole operation. And why don't labor, how can we get greater participation in labor? How can we ask labor to claim ownership within the workplace? Because if I am seen as an owner, I own in this, my participation would not be contentious, nor it would not be a situation where then there would be conflict. Because, and to bring home the point, I remember a number of years ago, the union asked the hotels to share profit sharing. If the maid see the light won't turn it on, turn it off. If the waiter sees anything you do, if you could get the visitor to spend more money at the bar, you would do that. And in the end, you would share in the profit. Now, when it reached the stage where then that the hotels put a cap. If you remember, the hotels put a cap and say, well, you can only get this amount. When the original agreement was that you would share in the profit. Now, what I am saying is that I want to see greater participation of labor as it relates to the whole scheme of things. And not only that, when I'm speaking, our leader and president asked us to come up with what is the new thing. What is the new thing that would bring us, that would touch each and every household? Just like in labor, we discussing labor relations, and my idea is that the greater participation of labor in the scheme of things. How can we apply a greater participation of the people in the democratic process of this country? That is the next thing, that the next progression in our movement. How can we get greater participation of the people in the democratic process of the country, and how can we get more labor participation into the companies or whatever it is that we respect labor to be.
I'm going to ask you to just give your thoughts on worker participation in the workplace and how that can be enhanced.
Thank you. Well, I know this has been a concept unions have been pushing for decades, the concept of worker participation. And I believe the mechanism of the social partnership, as Brother Albert was saying, actually provides the avenue through which you can have these discussions and meaningful ways of our workers working together. And I want to stress the point Bobby mentioned, the issue, I think there needs to be a greater focus, not only to unions, but in terms of business owners on productivity and competitiveness of Barbados. But I think, as we said before, what mechanisms and what systems do we need to put in place to achieve the objective of worker participation? And as you said, there's something for something. If workers participate more, what's in it for workers? Are they going to share profits? Is it going to be profit share? Is it going to be gain sharing? And I know the unions, from my own training in the union, I know this has been something going back 30, 40 years, the issue of gain sharing and profit share. Right, so that is a concept I know that it is a valid concept that could occur, but I think you're talking about cultural change because as Hal said earlier, there is an employer-employee relationship that comes first and foremost, that an employer employs an employee with terms and conditions, and the Employment Rights Act stipulates you have to stipulate the particulars and the conditions on which somebody is going to work. So it calls for that dialogue and the partnerships in terms of moving forward. Well, what I would suggest, Bobby, you use the word unity or unison, but for me it's actually something I'm researching. I think the more powerful concept is that of harmony, harmonization. And if I use the music metaphor, if I play one note at different octaves, it's the same note. But if I play multiple different notes in the right proportions, I get harmony, which really provides a much richer, more beautiful sound. So I think what we need to have within our organizations, and which I think the social partnership was, more harmonious relationships where we can appreciate differences. The union will always have its objective to protect the rights and interests of the workers, to ensure fairness and justice. The employer will have his or her responsibility to make profits, to increase sales, and to make sure that the standards are maintained. And I think the government overall, as Bobby said, the government has a responsibility to look after the national interest as a whole. So I think the concept of harmony helps us to achieve the objective that we're not trying to make people become alike, because that's be a very boring environment. But we really want to appreciate and respect the differences, and even in terms of the traditional voluntary system that is built on the fact that we are different, but we can still come to some solutions and agreements. And the final point I want to make quickly is, what you said is I think is critical, in that I think coming out of the social partnership, you would have seen unions playing a much more critical role in national development in very substantial committees, economics and finance. But even before that, you would have known unions would have been serving on various committees at the national level. But I think the social partnership really took unions to a totally different level, and it allows unions at the highest level of national development to be partners with a national government initiative. And as Cedric, that's a very interesting point you mentioned. You know, the fact that Singapore is still looking to Barbados for leadership should really tell us, as Basil Springer says, that Barbados really has the DNA for greatness. I think the problem is that we don't even know we got that DNA. That's it. We don't believe in our greatness.
Comrades, we've had a long and engaging evening. We may not have recognized the time has passed as quickly as it has. However, at this point, what I will do is to invite the panelists to make their final comments to us, recognizing that our topic for this evening was the evolving IR climate in Barbados and the way forward. I'll ask for their wrap-up comments to focus on what they would like to leave with us with respect to the way forward. Starting with Ambassador Morris.
Repeat that topic again.
Thank you very much, moderator. And thanks to the audience for being so participative and responding physically and otherwise to give us encouragement at this end. And it's been a real pleasure working with my colleagues. We've been together for a very long time. I said it kind of late, sister. But we're happy with that. We're happy with that as a maturing person, etc. My first response is this. Hopefully, if this discussion goes out to the public, we should be able to get some feedback. It's important that we monitor the feedback that we get from the people who are receiving this as we speak now. Very important. I believe that, as a colleague talked about, the democratizing process in Barbados has to start with conversations. I believe very strongly that we have to have national conversations on every important issue. But it has to be a structured conversation, one that is not biased. And that although we are in a political party tonight, we were not talking about politics, we are not talking about DLP or the BLP, we're talking about an issue. So we need to get these conversations. We must now understand that the people out there who are listening to us in Barbados and across the world, that they were abused to. And we have to get that, a process of feeding back from them what they thought about what happened in the night. That's very important. But I agree with Frank too. Eventually what I'm hoping is that there will be some kind of task force, you name it. It doesn't matter what you call it, a commission, a committee, or whatever, that is mandated by government to talk to the social partners, to academics, and whoever else. Let's look at industrial relations for Barbados over the next 20, 30, whatever years. That is really what you want to put your mind towards. And the final reflection I want to make is on the issue of productivity, competitiveness, etc. To me, that is fundamental to any discourse that we have, because that is what is going to make our country prosper or not prosper. That is going to determine what will happen to my grandchildren and your grandchildren. It's fundamental. That in the education system, we told it, to determine whether we'll have gun violence and people beating up people and so on, domestic violence, etc., etc. All of these things can be socially engineered. Let's understand. These things can be socially engineered because they're learned things. You learn how to do these things. You learn how to be productive. You're trained how to be productive. You're trained how to be peaceful and not to beat anybody and so on. All these are learned things. And once we understand that, you can train workers to be productive. As the colleague said, I was part of that experiment. I negotiated the first and only countrywide agreement about productivity in the hotels. I negotiated that with Ed Bushel on the other side. We took all of the hotels and we did record plans and scanning plans, etc. And we had to get so much information from those hotels in terms of what their receipts were, how much money they made at the end of the year, how many room nights there were, at what cost, etc. And then we look at the other costs in terms of crockery and those sorts of things, electricity, etc. And our intention was to make sure that you had productivity year on to the year on, so that you can then give workers some improvement. Because in those days, remember, you could not get salary increases by negotiation. It had to be by showing that there was productivity or profitability. And that's when we started the scheme. It was going so wonderfully well. And then we didn't go back there. And I'm saying this, there's nothing wrong with the emphasis on nice and customer behavior, but it does not have the same rate in our country as productivity discussions. Understand that? And we have fallen back in the area of negotiating productivity agreements. My question to the trade union movement, both the public and the private sector, at the end of the year, can you come and tell me how many new productivity agreements have been signed off? That is fundamental. And how do you improve it from one year to the next year? Because in the long run, workers have to understand that you have a right to a salary. You don't have a right to an increase on it. I want to get up on again. You have a right to a salary or a wage. You don't have a right to an increase on it. That increase comes because you're able to negotiate that your company is able to pay that. Your company is only able to pay that if they are productive, if they are profitable. And when I first came to the trade union movement, they told me that governments can always pay. You just do what you have to do, they just have to send the taxes that they can pay you. They told me governments could not become bankrupt. You and I know a different story. I don't know how we can have trade unionists who go and sit down and talk to the government in terms of negotiation without looking at the budget and studying it very carefully and looking at your estimates of revenue and expenditure to see what leg room government has. It's not about wishful thinking. It's about time we get some more money. It's not worth that way. Because let me tell you something. You might get the increase and then it's taken back from you. And so many different ways and you end up worse off than you first started. I need to see some scientific approaches. I need to see my trade unions trained in such a way that they're comfortable in things like statistics, economic analysis, managerial accounting, fundamental. They must have a number of skills, a package of skills, and the last one I would compliment with that is law. Your good trade unionists must know law. You must be conversant with law. Because the two big issues that you'll find in industrial relations will be issues about compensation, etc. And then your rights, should you be dismissed or suspended, etc. That's the lawyer to help you there. The other one, in terms of compensation, that's the person who has that mix of skills, accounting and economics, etc. And I'm not saying that we don't have those skills in the trade union movement. Don't say that I said that. I'm saying that we need to get more of those skills coming forward. And we have to get help from the government to know that I am unrepentant in my view, that government, as the senior of the three, has a responsibility to help the trade union movement. Let me repeat that. Government has a responsibility to help the trade union movement. If government is giving out national development scholarships in areas that they see need, let some trade unions get some to go and do masters and doctorate too. And then the trade union decide how they will keep the people in the movement, still working there. Government, examine the situation, see where the needs are. By the way, do I have any people from the Executive Council of Barbados working with you? Like, put your hand in the air. I see some beautiful places that I know, but I can't say heaven, I can't say. Those are my two trading colleagues. And do I have anybody from the Executive Council of the NUPW here tonight?
There was one, she left.
All right, next time.
I'm an ordinary member.
Huh?
I'm an ordinary member.
Ordinary member. All right, but you know why you focus on the executive member. That's a different thing altogether. But again, thank you very much for coming to this discourse. And I hope you'll have several more of them. We should see this as phase one and not the end. Thank you.
Yeah, I should like to suggest that for any evolving industrial relations climate, we must have a body of laws which would provide for the flourishing of the relationship between the employer and the employee. And for that to happen, government must pay strict attention to the implementation of its law reform committee, which would deal with issues as they arise and put the appropriate legislation in place as the exigencies demand. Now, law is evolutionary. You don't make people for law. You make law for people. Law regulates people. People don't regulate the law. So that the law will have to be tailored and adjusted to suit the evolving social conditions of the place and the demands which those conditions place on it from time to time. Now, there is already a very powerful body of legislation that deals with workers in the day-to-day scheme of things. We have Severance Payment Act, Safety at Work Act, Factories Act, etc., etc. We now have the Employment Rights Act, and so on. But even that Employment Rights Act, new as it is, will have to be looked at carefully, monitored, and see where there will be a need to do a few little twinkling here and a twinkling there, again, as the exigencies demand. But it is very important, and it will become even more important as people become, as workers become more militant. It will be very important for the trade union movement to understand the framework under which they can display that militancy. My colleague Bobby has made the point about the law, the importance of the law in the development of the trade union. That is very important, because I facetiously made a statement today that I've always seen trade unions as lawless institutions. That was one of Rick knows about me that statement. That's a facetious statement. But if you examine it, the strength of the trade union movement lies in its ability to get and organize support to deal with issues, and they do not necessarily have to rely on noble sentiments and ideal tactics and so on. It is a case of pragmatism. It is often a case of pragmatism. They see it as a means to an end. The end result is the important thing. But that notwithstanding, more and more the trade union is going to be called upon to examine how it has been exercising its business as a union, because the rule of law is a concept which cannot be ignored. We cannot have a lawless society, and any trade union activity will have to be carried out within that rule of law, philosophy and concept. So that I would like to generally say that the trade union may itself act as a kind of pressure group to encourage government in the revision of legislation which adversely affect the rights of workers. That is an area which I am not persuaded has been a major, has given any major thrust by the union. It was seen that unions become conspicuous when industrial action is taking place. And what happens when there's no industrial action, when the industrial climate is quiet and peaceful? We have no real indication that that period of quietude, if you want to call it that, is used for the encouragement the encouragement of pushing government into dealing with trade union legislation and labor's rights legislation, and so on and so on and so on. So the union should examine itself to see that its function may be even more broadly based than presently. But in doing that, it has to convince the public that it is not only an institution that is interested in industrial action, trade union education. Robert made the point there about scholarships and so on and so on. The Workers' Union has been valiant in its effort through its labor college and so on. But you cannot have an ignorant worker, and that is a fact which must be accepted. Ignorant workers are dangerous workers. So that the better trained the worker is, the better trained the worker can appreciate what his rights are, the better trained he would be able to appreciate what his obligations are. Because as we have been trying to suggest for the whole evening, this whole concept of justice, we see it as the ability to hold the scales at an even poise, so that there's fairness, there's equity, and concepts of that nature when workers and when employers and employees get involved in that very special contract of employment. I should like to thank you for listening to me. It's been a pleasure being here with my other colleagues and the moderator. I believe that these four are very, very, very important for the development of the party itself and its membership, because the party has got to develop itself to the point where workers, members, the membership generally, can discuss these issues intelligently. And do not get more people here on these occasions, because what I'm talking about here tonight, yes, I'm a lawyer and all that, but what I have discussed with you tonight requires no ability over and above what a lot of you have. And certainly, even if you cannot do as I have done, you can understand and appreciate the basic concepts which will guide you in your day-to-day lives and help you in being a responsible citizen. So I am thankful to be here. I commend the principal and his team for setting up this kind of forum, and I should like to extend my best wishes for its development. Thank you.
Yes. Thank you, moderator. And in summation, I think the unions need to move beyond the negotiating for terms and conditions of service and the collective bargaining agreements and looking at issues, maybe breaches in contract, that's what Brother Ulrich said, and Bobby, to be concerned about other issues, such as issues of productivity. There's a serious problem of labor productivity in Barbados. The curve has been flat for the last 10 years, right? So we have problems of productivity, national productivity, and competitiveness. And I think unions need now to continue even to a greater level to make that contribution to the business of Barbados. And I want to reinforce the point that I believe one of the greatest things that evolved out of Barbados was this concept of the social partnership. And I'm wondering whether we are taking it for granted, and that the successes and how it was able to help Barbados grow and develop from difficult times in the 90s to now. But I think we should not take for granted the significance and importance of it. The second point I want to stress is to the unionists present, and my colleague Dennis is in the back. You need to work towards dealing with the issue of C2SAB as the National Congress for Barbados. It is something that has to be looked at, and it's something that has to be fixed. And thirdly, I believe that the concept of the issue of change is something that has to be addressed by unions, that the Barbados landscape has changed. We haven't even spoken tonight about what we want. We want international investors to invest in Barbados. We want people to bring their millions to Barbados. And one of the things international investors would look at in their country risk assessments would be the nature of the industrial relations environment. So I think this is something, again, unions need to understand. We are now in a very complex world. I believe everybody here should know that this week the Chinese economy had a blip, and the whole world is shaking. The whole world. So even the international economists are saying now they did not even, they did not recognize the role that the Chinese economy played in the global economy. So we're talking about the international impacts of that could impact on Barbados. We are not back in the 70s and 80s and 90s, as Bobby said, that we can just be concerned about looking for increases. We need to look at productivity and performance enhancement schemes helping us to improve. And that is where agencies like the Productivity Council, we could find unions working much more closely with the Productivity Council and other national agencies to ensure that we look at say, other gain sharing systems or productivity enhancement systems. And the final point I want to make is that the concern I have for Barbados is that, as I said earlier, Barbados is a country that was poised for greatness for many decades, right? We know that the world always looked at Barbados as a very special place, right? We know that. I think the challenge for us, for the unions in moving forward, and remember, we know the other stakeholders are important, but this move tonight is really speaking about the unions. And I think, I truly believe, from my studies overseas in England and traveling, that Barbados is truly Barbados is a very interesting country, you know. Barbados is a very powerful country. We have the potential for greatness, and that is where each individual person, and I'm not talking about the body politic, or we need to think about we think about trade unions as groups of people, and the collective is okay, but the only way a trade union can be powerful is by each and every member growing and developing with the trade union as the country develops. Because if the country is developing and the average rank and file in the union are not developing to the level of sophistication required of a sophisticated country and economy as Barbados is aiming to be, I think we're going to have some significant problems and maybe some unrest. And that is where I'm saying, if we truly believe that Barbados is a country poised for greatness and we have the DNA for greatness, and if you look at our history and trajectory, the fact that Eric is telling me Singapore, one of the most sophisticated and wealthy countries in the world, is asking us to come to tell them about something we started and we are doubting, I think we need maybe to step back as individual people to look at what we want to be for the future. And I believe the trade unions, as representatives of the average rank and file and working person in Barbados, both public and private, working collectively, Cedric, as a trade union congress, and stepping back to look at national development, I'm sure that you will be better poised then to be part of this agenda for national and sustainable development and competitiveness and productivity, as Bobby said. And then is where the true power of the social partnership that really took Barbados out of difficulty and allowed us to have growth over in difficult times, that is when we will really start to see the power of a social partnership, which says that we respect the unions have a sustainable role to play in the future, we respect that the employer has a right to set up a business and expect to make profits and expect workers to be productive and work for the salary that they're given. And we expect, as Bobby said, that ultimately any government elected by the people has a responsibility to ensure the sustainable growth and development of each and every person within the society. And that's, I think, in essence, what the social partnership is about. And I see that as the future role for unions within that. Thank you very much.
Ladies and gentlemen, we have had a very engaging session. We recognize exactly how complex the discipline of industrial relations really is, because we've touched on many things. We've touched on law, we've touched on development, we've touched on economics, and we still have not touched them all. So we really would like to thank the panel, really, and that is going to be done formally, but for highlighting to us exactly how complex, when we talk about industrial relations, we talk about relationships. And when we talk about relationships, then we know from our very own relationships how complex they can be. So when we take it beyond that into much greater and wider realms, we recognize how much more there is. At this point, I'm going to thank you very much for being here. As I said, it's going to be done much more formally. But I'm going to crave your indulgence for 2 minutes as Mr. De Silva introduces us to a piece of literature that he wants us to be aware of. And immediately after that, Dr. Leah Garner O'Neill is going to come and give the